As always, it's our Bible class, and questions and short comments are welcome. I want to look at this topic of how do we understand many of the prophecies of the Old Testament. I won't make it a general comprehensive examination of all the prophecies, but there is a general principle in how we approach many of these prophecies, or how we ought to approach many of them, especially the prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and what we call the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos. These prophets, they're some of these prophecies are really very difficult especially if you take them as literal representations. Very difficult. I know that, for example, the shepherd rods. Most of us might be familiar with them, but they believe that based on those prophecies, sometime in the near future, God is going to take his people back to the land of Palestine, that an angel is going to pass through and destroy all Seventh-day Adventists except for the shepherd rods, and they will be taken to Palestine, where they will set up a kingdom. And they believe that the prophet Victor Houteff, who they regard as a prophet, will come back to life then, and Ellen White will come back to life, and they'll set up a kingdom down there in Israel. And all of this is based on a hybrid, strange interpretation of these Old Testament prophecies. You know that many of these evangelicals today still hold that Israel, the Jews, physical Jews, are still God's special people. And they believe that many of the prophecies in the book of Revelation will be fulfilled in relation to the Jews. They still believe that God will go back to dealing with the Jews as he did in the Old Testament times and safeguard them against the other nations. Many of these beliefs are based on these prophecies of the Old Testament, and even many Adventists who have a better understanding, they still are confused about some of these prophecies. I'm not going to profess that I have any kind of perfect understanding, but at the same time, in studying the Old Testament and in looking at these prophecies, I've come to see that there is a certain principle to how most of them are to be approached and to be understood. And so I would like to share that principle this afternoon. But like I said, any short comments or questions, you're welcome to interrupt me. I know that sometimes when one person is talking, it gets a little tedious, a little boring. My wife always says, when I'm the only person talking, it gets boring for her. So if anybody wants to interrupt me a little now and then, if you find yourself falling asleep, then please do so by all means. So she's quarreling in the background. All right. She says I am misrepresenting her, so I'm reporting on her properly. That's what I thought she said. Okay, she said she didn't say that. Okay. All right, we're going to go to the Bible. Let me just set it up here. All right, so let me see, share screen. All right, so let me turn, this is getting in the way, exit. Now we should be able to see it. All right, there we are. So I'm going to just simply look at a few of these prophecies, and then we're going to comment on them, and we're going to look at what the Bible says is how it was interpreted, how these prophecies were interpreted by people in the New Testament. First of all, I'm going to look at some of those that are a little more challenging. One brother asked me, brother Michael asked me a couple of days ago concerning this prophecy in Jeremiah 30, which he says is still a challenge to him. I'm going to read it. And then If anybody can tell me, when do you think this is fulfilled? When do you think this is fulfilled? Then you could go ahead. But listen to what it says. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord God of Israel, saying, Write thee all the words that I have spoken unto thee in a book. Now here's what it says. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. It says, God says he's going to bring back Israel and Judah, both kingdoms, the Jews and Israel. He will bring them again. I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Now, this was written in the days of Jeremiah. And if you're familiar with Bible history, you know that by the time Jeremiah became a prophet, the 10 tribes had already been taken away by the Assyrians. The Assyrians came and conquered the 10 tribes and took them away. And to this day, those 10 tribes have never been identified. Nobody knows where they are. And that is the reason why there is so much speculation today. Some black people say that the black people are the real 10 tribes, that they were taken down to Africa. And down in Africa, they were taken. They were taken in slavery over to the West Indies and America. So some people say that the black people in the West Indies and America are the true Jews. Everybody wants to be a Jew. Herbert Armstrong, everybody wants to be an Israelite. Herbert W. Armstrong, he said that they actually migrated over to America and they became the Red Indians. No, I'm sorry, not Armstrong. Armstrong says they migrated into Europe, they became the British people, and the descendants of those British people came over and founded America. So he says the Americans and the British are the real Israelites. And of course, the Mormons say that they migrated into America and they became the Red Indian tribes. So the Red Indians were the descendants of these Israelites. So everybody wants to be an Israelite. So there have been all kinds of convoluted ideas as to what happened to these 10 tribes. And the honest truth is, I don't have a clue. But the Bible says that they were taken away by the Assyrians and they were scattered among the nations. And they probably just, in my opinion, they just became absorbed in the other races. And of course, the Jews later on, they were never quite destroyed in that way, because God promised that they wouldn't be. But they went away to Babylon. And then after Babylon, they were taken back to the land of Palestine, and they established their kingdom. When the Romans came and destroyed Israel, they took them away captive as well. But the Jews maintained their identity. Wherever they went, they didn't intermarry with other people. And so Jews today still have a very clear identity. Well, there are some stories about the Jews being dispossessed by another group of people, and who we think are Jews today, they're not the real Jews. To be honest, I have not gotten into the details of history to be able to tell whether that is true or not. But the point is, after I get through all that speculation and conspiracy theory and so on, the point is, God says, the days will come that I will bring again the captivity of my people, Israel and Judah. He doesn't only say Judah, he says Israel and Judah, which normally means the 10 tribes, the 12 tribes, the full complement of the 12 tribes. I will bring again Israel and Judah, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. So it says that if you take that literally, it means that the 12 tribes of Israel and plus Levi, they are going to return to Palestine, and they are going to possess Palestine again. You can understand why there is this obsession with some Christians who don't understand the Bible. There is this obsession with dispossessing the Palestinians. They don't want the war that is taking place between the Jews and the Palestinians. They have already made up their mind that the Jews are the people who will possess this land, and they are to drive out the other Palestinians, because God says, I will make them return to this land. And every time the Jews take a step to dispossess the Palestinians, they claim it as God at work. And of course, America has been very proactive in supporting Israel in this work. And of course, it is because the Jews in America and the evangelicals in America are a very powerful lobby group. And they have a lot of money and a lot of influence, and they influence a lot the direction that the American government takes with regard to Israel. As far as these people are concerned, Israel can do nothing. No matter how unjust it is and how unfair, they can do nothing because they are still living on the basis of these Old Testament concepts. Now remember that in the Old Testament times, Israel had the legitimate right to wipe out the Amalekites, to destroy the Canaanites, to commit genocide upon the nations around them. God told them to slaughter them. It didn't matter that they were in the land first. God says, I have given you this land. They were to go in and dispossess these people and wipe them out and destroy their altars and tear down, destroy their civilizations and set up Palestine as a land for the Israelites, regardless of who was there first. And the claim of these people is that God has given this land to the Jews, to the Hebrews, forever. So, what we regard as justice, what we regard as common human decency, because the Palestinians might have been there first for a long time, they don't regard as meaning anything because they say God gave this land to the Jews. If you reason like this, just to stray a little bit, if you reason like this, then you can see that the black people who say we need to go back to Africa, they have some kind of justification. Because if you are going to reason on the basis of where people originally had their original place, then all the white people need to leave America and the black people need to leave America and restore it to the Indians. You can't argue like that. The world has been reconfigured. How God used to deal with nations back in the Old Testament time, he no longer deals with nations this way. But people want to return to this kind of policy where the Jews are concerned, but not for the rest of the world. So I hope you can understand that principle. As far as they are concerned, the Jews, because of the blood that runs in their veins, they are God's people in a peculiar way, and nobody else really matters. All of this is based on Old Testament ideas, and it is supported by these Old Testament prophecies if you don't understand them. So, as I said, look at this verse. God says, I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And these are the words that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. Let me go on and read a little further. For thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Notice who this concerns. It concerns Israel and Judah. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Now, if you are a Seventh-day Adventist and you read your great controversy and you read these books, you know that this prophecy, this verse 7, it has been applied to the time of trouble. When God's people, well, Adventists will interpret this as Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath keepers, right? When they are under great persecution and the death decree has been passed, and it seems like they are certain to die. And this verse in particular has been applied, especially by Ellen White, where it says, it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. So you can see that at least Ellen White is very clear, Adventists are very clear in not interpreting this verse to apply to the literal Jews, the literal Israelites. They have applied the prophecy to deal in a spiritual way, and I believe that they are absolutely correct. They may not be correct in identifying who is Israel today. They might be limiting it to the Adventists and Sabbath keepers, when I might think it has a broader application than that. But at the same time, this approach where they are looking at this Old Testament prophecy, which seems to be clearly speaking of the Jews and the Israelites, and they're applying it to modern Israel. I am fully in harmony with that. But at the same time, you can't take one part of the prophecy and apply it in a spiritual way, and then you take other parts of the prophecy and interpret it in a physical way. You can't do that. You have to be consistent. So when the Bible says Israel and Judah, if God is speaking about modern Israel, then modern Israel is being categorized as Israel and Judah. Do we have two divisions among Christians that you can call Israel and Judah? Or is it simply God using the terminology of that day to speak to the condition of today? And I'll show you something else. We looked at this already. God says, I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers. So this is challenging for people because they say, look, it says clearly, I'm going to let them go back to the land. Which land has God given to us today as spiritual Israel? Isn't it clear that it's talking about a physical place? But let's look at these difficulties, and then I will try to face all of them in one go. I'll deal with all of them at one time. God says, for it shall come to pass in that day, said the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off thy neck, and will burst thy bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him. Verse 9, but they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. So it goes further than simply saying that God is going to deliver his people. But he says he's going to carry them back to the land that he gave to them, and he's going to set up David, their king, over them. He says in verse 10, therefore fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, said the Lord, neither be dismayed, O Israel, for lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return and shall be in rest, and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. Look at the next verse, which is seems even more compelling. For I am with thee, said the Lord, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee. So God mentions nations. So it seems very clear. It seems that God is speaking about nations like Israel, like Assyria, like Edom, like Moab, like Babylon, like Greece, nations where he scattered his people, and he says, I'll make an end of those nations, but I will not make a full end of thee, like he's speaking about the Jews for sure. Now, these are some of the challenging statements, and I'm going to look at a couple of passages here that will begin to give us a clue as to how we should approach these passages. Let me go to one that we are very familiar with. All right, Jeremiah 31. And I'll go down to verse, we're familiar with this one, so I want to start with this one. All right, see what he says here. Behold, the days come, said the Lord. I'm starting from verse 27, Jeremiah 31. Behold, the days come, said the Lord, that I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast. And it shall come to pass that like as I have watched over them to pluck up and to break down and to throw down and to destroy and to afflict, so will I watch over them to build and to plant, said the Lord. So this is talking also about the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Same thing we are looking at, right? And God says he's going to watch over them to build them and to plant, said the Lord. Some change is coming. In those days they shall say no more, the fathers have eaten a sour grape and the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, the Israelites apparently were saying, our fathers committed these abominations and we are suffering the consequences. That's what the phrase means, right? Our fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. They did the wrong and we suffer the consequences. God says, In those days when I do this, they're not going to say this anymore. In those days, everyone shall die for his own iniquity. Every man that eateth the sour grape, his teeth shall be set on edge. God is saying, in other words, that the system is going to be an equitable system. You're not going to have people suffering for the sins of other people when I restore the system, the things, right? But here is the place that gives us a clue. Here we begin to see a clue as to how we should approach these prophecies. Look at what God says. Behold, the days come, said the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. With who? The house of Israel and the house of Judah. He mentions the two parts again. It's the same language he's using. And he says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, said the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, said the Lord. I will put my law in their heart, in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, are we familiar with this statement? To understand what is happening here, we simply need to go to the Apostle Paul in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 10. Paul applies this prophecy to what happened to God's people when they received the Holy Spirit. God has made a new covenant, and he is applying the house of Judah and the house of Israel to the Christian body, the Christian believers, not to literal Israel, not to the literal Jews, and not to the literal Hebrews. But let me read on a little bit further to show you that in the same prophecy, this is what Paul continued to say. And they shall teach no man, Paul continued to quote Jeremiah when he said, they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, said the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. This is the new covenant. And God says it will be for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now, right after he says this, look at what God says next. Thus said the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If these ordinances depart from before me, said the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus said the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, said the Lord. Now, this is one of the striking prophecies in the Bible that many people use to say that Israel will always be God's people, meaning the physical Israel. God says, what will have to happen first? Before God will cast off Israel, and he mentions Judah and Israel, before this happens, the ordinance of the moon and the stars and the sun and the waves of the sea will have to cease before Israel will stop being God's people forever. God says, before the only way he will cast off the seed of Israel for all the wicked things they did was if heaven above could be measured, or the foundations of the earth could be searched out. Has anybody ever measured heaven? Has anybody ever searched out the foundations of the earth? No. Therefore, Israel cannot be cast off. But the question is, brothers and sisters, how do you take a part of this prophecy and apply it in a new covenant way? And you take a part of the prophecy and apply it in an old covenant way. How do you do this? You make God a confused, inconsistent person. Paul explains, and it's very clear to all of us, that this prophecy applies to the New Testament, New Covenant Israel. Therefore, all the elements of the prophecy, you have to apply them in a New Covenant way. And how do we do this? I'm going to come to that in just a moment. But let's look at another prophecy. Ezekiel 36. I'm going to read from verse 17 and read a few verses here. And again, remember, please, I am imploring you, if you are getting sleepy, or you find all of this uninteresting, or you're not understanding, please interrupt me. I'm very anxious that we should get what I'm trying to share this afternoon. And most of us might be familiar with it, but it's helpful to look at it again and to cement the ideas in our minds. It's helpful because there are so many confusing ideas about this particular issue, many confusing ideas out there in the religious world. From verse 17, it says, Son of man, when the house of Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it by their own way and by their doings. Their way was before me as the uncleanness of a removed woman. Wherefore I poured my fury upon them for the blood that they had shed upon the land and for their idols wherewith they had polluted it. And I scattered them among the heathen, and they were dispersed through the countries according to their way, and according to their doings I judged them. And when they entered in unto the heathen, whither they went, they profaned my holy name when they said to them, These are the people of the Lord, and are gone forth out of his land. So everywhere they went, they dishonored the name of God. And God could not claim them as his own because they profaned his name when they went among the heathen. But I had pity for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the heathen, whither they went. Therefore say unto the house of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God, I do not this for your sakes, O house of Israel, but for mine holy name's sake, which you have profaned among the heathen, whither you went. And I will sanctify my great name, which was profaned among the heathen, which you have profaned in the midst of them. And the heathen shall know that I am the Lord, saith the Lord God, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. Now look what he says next, verse 24 down. For I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries, and will bring you into your own land. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh. What is this speaking about? Anybody want to comment on that? What is this speaking about?
The only thing that I could think that, David, is that this is it's telling like to a future tense, like what you first started saying.
Yeah, it's the new covenant. Yeah.
Right. Brother Alan and Brother Raymond. I didn't get much of what you said, Brother Raymond, because you kept cutting out. But as Brother Alan said, it's the new covenant. This is a clear reference to the new covenant. A new heart I will give you. I will take away the stony heart. I give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. This is the new covenant. Christ in you, giving you a new nature, giving you a new spirit, so that you keep God's principles. You live by God's principles on the basis of a new heart. But immediately it goes on to say, and you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. It goes on to say, I will call for the corn and will increase it and lay no famine upon you, and I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the increase of the field, that you shall receive no more reproach of famine among the heathen. All of this God says he's going to do as a part of that whole process. And he goes on in verse 33, Thus said the Lord God, in the day that I shall have cleansed you from all your iniquities, I will also cause you to dwell in the cities, and the waste shall be builded, and the desolate land shall be tilled, whereas it lay desolate in the sight of all that passed by. And they shall say, this land that was desolate is become like the Garden of Eden, and the desolate and the ruined cities are become fenced and are inhabited. Then the heathen that are left round about you shall know that I, the Lord, build the ruined places and plant that was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I will do it. So, if you don't think that this is confusing, maybe you have not been reading it along with me, but it is confusing because there are elements of it that we see clearly apply to our time, and yet there are elements of it that you just can't seem to fit out. Where does this come in, right? It's talking about the new covenant, but then it says they are going to go back to the land, and they're going to plow the land again, and they're going to build cities and all of it. It seems to be speaking of a very literal thing. The way, as your brother Raymond, the way many people have interpreted it is that it's talking about when we get into the new earth. And in the new earth, they are going to build and they are going to plant, and then, but it talks about the heathen round about you. Are there going to be heathen around you in the new earth? So that answer is not adequate. It doesn't answer all the questions. Yes, brother Raymond, go ahead.
Yeah, I hope you hear me now. Yeah, it's kind of hard to balance this one out because it's talking about it was going to give a new land under, to the believers under the new covenant, and we're going to possess that new land. Yet, we're considered to be spiritual Israel. So, what new land is this talking about? Starting with, I know there's a new land coming from heaven, but it seems here that it's saying that's going to give us a land where we're going to be in peace. While we're here, is what I'm thinking. If I try to make any sense out of this, in my mind, I would think, well, so we're going to get a new land. We're going to possess it, just like the old covenant, but this is new. So, and if we are spiritual Israel, what land is it? Because we are all scattered around the world.
Yes, yes, right. So these are some of the challenges with these Old Testament prophecies. And as I said, we are going to look at a resolution in just a moment. But I want to make the picture very clear so we understand why people find them to be sometimes confusing and why they misunderstand and misinterpret them. Look at Ezekiel 34 and verse 23, for example. God says, verses 23 and 24, and I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. Even my servant David, he shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken it. And I will make with them a covenant of peace, and will cause the evil beast to cease out of the land, and they shall dwell safely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods. And I will make them and the places round about my hill a blessing, and I will cause the shower to come down in his season. There shall be showers of blessing. That's one of the things that God promises again, and it seems to be set in a very physical setting. In chapter 37 of the same book, he says the same thing. And David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments, observe my statutes, and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I gave unto Jacob my servant. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. So anyway, we're going to try to start looking now at how do we understand these prophecies. And the best way we can understand them is, first of all, as I said, by looking at how they were interpreted in the new covenant. How did the apostles, how did they look at these prophecies and how did they interpret them? I'm going to look at one that we might be familiar with. It's in Amos 9 verse 15. I'm going to verse 10, Amos 9. I'm going to read it, and then I want you to forget anything that you know and just think about, if you were reading this, how would you understand it? It says, all the sinners of my people shall die by the sword, which say the evil shall not overtake nor prevent us. In that day, will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old. What does God promise? He promises that he's going to build back the temple, the tabernacle of David. I just need to mute a little bit here, everybody. He's going to build up the tabernacle of David. You read this and you think God is going to rebuild the temple. He's going to have the temple rebuilt, right? I will raise up his ruins. I will build it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and of all the heathen, which are called by my name, said the Lord, that doeth this. So when in the Old Testament, when you heard about them possessing another people, it meant that they would overthrow them, take them out of their land, dispossess them, and you would take over that country. This is what it means. Now, I'd like you to see how this was interpreted by the apostles in the time of the apostles. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 16, most of us know what was happening in Acts 15. It was a council of Jerusalem where the Jews were saying, the Jewish believers were saying that the Gentiles had to keep the law. And they had this big council in Jerusalem where they were discussing the issue.
Jesus.
And then Paul and others were Paul and others were arguing that there was no need for them to keep the law. And then finally, I think it was James who got up and he began to speak, and he says, Simeon has declared, Peter has declared how God did at the first visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. Okay, so God visited the Gentiles, and he was gathering believers out from among the Gentiles. And he says, to this agree the words of the prophets. He is saying that the prophets of the Old Testament already told us that this would happen. As it is written, he's now beginning to interpret the same passage that we just read. The passage says, after this I will return and build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, said the Lord, who doeth these things. This is how they interpreted the passage that we just read. They applied it to the preaching of the gospel and to the converting of the Gentiles to Christianity. I want to go back and look at what we saw in Amos, because in the book of Amos, it does not speak in this context at all. In the book of Amos, it talks about, yes, it talks about the tabernacle of David, right? When God talks about the rebuilding of the tabernacle of David, obviously, he's not speaking about building a physical temple. He was speaking of building the spiritual temple, the temple in which we all are a part. The temple, the spiritual temple, the church, is the tabernacle of David. And yet the way that the Bible puts it, you would think they're going to go back to building a temple out of mortar and brick, because the Old Testament prophecy presents it in that way. But the New Testament makes us know that the real meaning is a spiritual temple. The New Testament focuses on spiritual things which are presented to us in the Old Testament in physical pictures. I hope we're able to understand that. Go back to Amos and look at this again. Amos 9, 10 to 15. Amos says, in that day, first of all, he says, all the sinners of my people shall die by the sword. I don't even know if that happened at Pentecost. I suppose you could say Ananias and Sapphira dropped down dead. Maybe they were the two, right? But you couldn't really apply this in a literal way. In that day, I will raise up the tabernacle of David. What it was talking about was the building of the spiritual tabernacle, the building of the spiritual church. But it's using the idea of that old tabernacle which had fallen down. I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen. I will close up the breaches thereof. It talks about rebuilding. You close up the walls where they are fallen down. I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom. Edom is a nation. It's a heathen nation. And all the heathen. See how James interprets it, all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, said the Lord. So the conquering of the heathen, the overthrow of the heathen, is interpreted to mean the converting of the heathen to Christianity. Just using this principle alone, I'm going to suggest to you that whenever you come upon prophecies in the Old Testament, especially those that relate to the last days, you have to change all the symbols completely. You cannot look at them as referring to physical things. You have to reinterpret them to mean spiritual realities. That's the first thing we need to understand. If we don't do this, we are going to be prone to misinterpret and misunderstand. So the land that I gave to their fathers does not mean the land of Palestine. The tabernacle does not mean the place that David built where they had the priests ministering and all of that. It means something completely different. If that building can mean something as vague or seemingly vague as a Christian church, where are the walls? Where is the ceiling? Where's the roof? Where's the holy place? Where's the most holy place? Where are the animals sacrificed? None of that is applicable in the context of the temple that God is speaking about. Paul tries to explain, and Paul says that Jesus Christ is a chief cornerstone, and each of us is a stone in the building. So we're not speaking of a physical place at all. We're speaking of a spiritual temple. But the old temple, the old Palestine, the old land of Israel, the old Jews, they were all representative of this greater spiritual reality. We have to interpret the symbols or we end up extremely confused. Here is another example of where some of our people are confused. I'll go to a few passages here in the book of Isaiah. Let me use one that we have commented on, but I like to go to this one because it is so misunderstood. It is so misrepresented sometimes. Look at this. It says very simple and very clearly. It's one of our favorite verses. Isaiah 66, 22 and 23. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, said the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, said the Lord. And we always use that passage, of course, to prove that in the new earth, we're going to keep the Sabbath. It's interesting, the feast keepers love this verse because it also says, from one new moon to another. And reasonably, if you say this means we are going to be keeping Sabbaths, then it also means that we are probably going to be keeping the new moon celebrations as well. So anyway, be that as it may. But we read these and we come to an abrupt halt because we don't want to read the verse that follows. But the verse that follows begin, and, which means that in addition to keeping the Sabbath and in addition to keeping the new moons, they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. So if you take the part about the Sabbath and the new moon literally, then you must take the last part literally also. On the Sabbaths, one of our pastimes will be to go out and look upon people being eaten by worms who are going to be burning, but the fire won't be quenched, and they are continually going to be burning. One of the verses that people use to support an everlasting burning hell. And of course, we don't accept verse 24. Therefore, even though I believe that in the new earth we will observe the Sabbath, I would not use this verse. I cannot use this verse to support it. And I'll explain. I'm going to try to put my thoughts together here now to try to explain how would I explain these passages. Let me go to another one. I'm jumping about a little bit, but there's a reason to this. All right, I want to show you some of the things that are irreconcilable so that we can come to the conclusion there's only one way to reconcile these things. In chapter 65, the previous chapter. Here's what God says in verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered, nor come into mind. But be ye glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and her people a joy. And I will rejoice in Jerusalem, and joy in my people. And the voice of weeping shall be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. Same thing, right? There shall be no more thence, look at this verse, there shall be no more thence an infant of days, nor an old man that hath not filled his days. Verse, the last part says, for the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. And they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit, they shall not plant and another eat, for as the days of a tree are the days of my people, and mine elect shall long enjoy the work of their hands. So how do you explain this? It talks about beautiful things. We will plant vineyards and eat them, build houses and inhabit them. But it says that children will die at 100 years old, and sinners being 100 years old shall be accursed in the new earth. And here is how I'm going to suggest, what I'm going to suggest concerning these prophecies. After I make my statement, please ask me whatever questions there are, and if I can, I will answer. But I'm going to explain how the only way we can reconcile these prophecies. The prophecies of the Old Testament are like what I would refer to as parables. All of us can understand a parable, because a parable is the simplest way people explain it. They say it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's how people interpret parables. I would say it's a story that has a concealed meaning. The story is usually not true in many of the details. Sometimes it is, sometimes not. Many of the details don't fit. Because when you tell a parable, when Jesus told a parable, he was not meaning that you should understand the details. He was meaning that you should understand the moral behind the story, or the idea behind the story. And just in case anybody does not agree with me, I can give you a very clear parable that was straight out not the truth, and Jesus told it. And it's the parable of the rich man who died and went to hell. They said Jesus never said anything that was fictitious. That story was fiction. The meaning is the truth. The meaning is true, but the story was fiction. A rich man died and went to hell, and a poor man died and went and sat in Abraham's bosom. It's fiction. It's a made-up story. Because the point is not the story. If you're a silly person, if you're one of those legalistic people in your approach to the Bible, one of those literalists who don't understand how the Bible is written and the meaning of the Bible, you think that Jesus is teaching a doctrinal point that when people die, they go straight to hell or to Abraham's bosom. And that is how many people interpret that prophecy, that parable. But it's not a parable about what happens to people when they die. The meaning of the parable, Jesus wanted to make the point, look, if you don't believe the Bible, if you don't believe Moses and the prophets, even if somebody comes to you from the dead, you're not going to believe. That was his point. That was his point. So the story is not accurate in its details. You could say the same thing about the prodigal son. I don't know if a boy really left home and went and ate pig's food. I don't know, but it could be. Maybe it wasn't. But Jesus told the story because he wanted to make a point. The same thing about the Good Samaritan. The same thing about the widow who lost one piece of coin, and she lit a lamp and swept her house until she found the one piece of coin. These stories were told to make a point, not to tell you that the details of the story are true. Now, that's the first thing to understand when you read these prophecies in the Old Testament. How did these people obtain these visions, these prophecies? I am not sure. I'm not sure if they got into a trance and then they saw pictures or they heard words. But whatever it was, the details of many of these prophecies Like, for example, in Jeremiah chapter, I think it's 24, God said that he would raise up a great whirlwind from the four corners of the earth. And the slain of the Lord would be at that day from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. And they would not be lamented, nor gathered, nor buried. They would be dung upon the ground. He gives them pictures, he gives them ideas, and they write down these ideas. But it is up to people of later generations, as we are directed by the Holy Spirit, to understand what is being said here. So I'm going to say it as simply as I can. What we are to do is to look at these prophecies, these Old Testament prophecies, and take the overall meaning instead of the details. When it says, okay, I want somebody to answer, just to make sure that you are with me. When it says, David, my servant, shall be king over them, what does that mean? Anybody? I'm sure we all know.
But it means Christ will be king. Christ will be king over them because he's the seed of David.
Thank you. Absolutely right. Now, in the Old Testament, it does not say the seed of David. It says David, because God promised David an everlasting kingdom, and that there would be somebody upon the throne to rule forever. When God made this promise to David, like when he made the promise to Abraham that in your seed shall all nations be blessed. In your seed all nations will be blessed. Who was the seed of Abraham? It was Isaac. Isaac was the seed of Abraham, and yet God made a promise, and it was not in Isaac that all the world would be blessed. It was a promise of Christ. Christ also came from the line of Abraham, yes. But the prophecy was not referring to the physical seed of Abraham. And Paul makes a point in Galatians 3 that the children of faith, these are the seed of Abraham. It was talking about spiritual things. Now let me ask you, God has an Israel today. God has an Israel today. Who is the king of Israel today? It's Jesus Christ. Has the prophecy been fulfilled when God says, I will take you out of all nations and gather you into your own land? I should ask the question, is the prophecy being fulfilled? Because you have to take these prophecies and you have to apply them in a new covenant way. Because in the new covenant, what are the countries that God's people have been scattered to? Just to make sure you're still with me, can somebody give me the name of one of these countries where God's people have been scattered?
Everywhere. Every country.
All right, every country. All right, I'd like somebody to give me a name.
Well, Australia's one.
Jamaica.
All right, Jamaica, Australia. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. Somebody else try again.
China.
Huh?
China.
No, not even China.
Jerusalem.
America. U.S.
Not even
Jerusalem.
America.
Babylon.
Thank Sister Maria is kind of on my wavelength. Somebody said Babylon. Absolutely. Absolutely. Remember, we are using the concepts of the Old Testament. If we say Israel, where was Israel scattered? They were scattered to Babylon. They were scattered to Egypt. So God's people today, in Revelation, we see God saying, come out of Babylon, my people. So God's people are already coming out of Babylon. We already see God's people being gathered into their own land. Our land is the land of Israel. Israel is a spiritual place where Christ is king. Those who have become a part of the Christian body have left out of Babylon, they have left out of Egypt, and they have come to Israel. So we are not only the people Israel, but we are also in the land of Israel because we are ruled over by the King of Israel. These prophecies are being fulfilled in a spiritual way. This is not to deny that one day they'll actually be a physical place, but many of the conditions that we are seeing in these prophecies will never exist when we get into that literal place. They won't exist anymore. These prophecies are presenting a picture of where God's people are still in a place where you still have elements of negativity, but they rise above these elements. So the key to understanding is that you have to look at these prophecies and you have to apply them in a spiritual way. You have to understand how to give us the spiritual equivalent of the things that we are reading. So when God talks about his people are going to be dwelling in a place where they are going to be keeping the Sabbath and the new moons, and they're going to be looking at the people whose carcasses, the carcasses of the people who sinned against God, and worms will not die, and all the rest of it. That prophecy is particularly interesting because it is clear what God is doing. He's giving us an idea of what his people of those days considered to be perfect. If you were a Hebrew living back in the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, what would be the greatest disaster for you? We think that we have never suffered anything else, anything yet. They saw the Babylonians come in and cut open the bellies of the pregnant women and slaughter their young men and butcher their old people until their blood ran in the streets like water. We have never seen anything like the devastation that came upon those people. They saw famine conditions where the women started eating their own children. They saw the land that God gave them decimated, all the people taken out of it and taken as captives to a foreign land. Nothing we have ever experienced in our lifetime has ever been so terrible. And then God tells them, God says, I'm bringing you back to your own country. And there's going to be peace, and your enemies are going to be your footstool. And the things that you can that pertain to a perfect existence, you will be able to keep your Sabbaths and your new moons and your feast days, and your worship system will be in place, and you'll have a righteous king reigning over you, and all the people who fought against God and who stood up against you, they are going to be on the garbage heap. Why do I say the garbage heap? Because the garbage heap is a place where they threw dead bodies and they threw old rubbish. And in those days, they didn't have the sanitization system that we have today. I can tell you about it because until a few years ago, there was a place in Jamaica, there's a place in Kingston called Riverton City Dump, where they never had the proper infrastructure to deal with all the garbage. It's a huge garbage dump. The garbage was going there continually, and everything went to that dump, many acres. And I hardly ever went to Kingston without seeing a constant smoke rising in the air from Riverton City Dump. And they had dead. I mean, in Jamaica, you pick up dead dogs on the road because they just stray around the place. Cars kill them all the time. They scoop them up, they threw them on the dump, and they burn them. And so anytime you went there, the worm did not die. You could see dead bodies being eaten by maggots in certain corners. You could see the fire is not quenched. It was constantly burning. They found a way to solve that situation. You have better facilities now, but for many years it was always like that, constantly. And they burned old tires, everything there, you know. But this is what Isaiah, God is talking about in Isaiah. The worm shall not die and the fire is not quenched. He said the people who fought against God would be thrown on the garbage dump. That's what he's saying. He's using the picture of something that has been discarded and that is no more use and that is only fit for destruction. He's not talking about any eternal burning hell. He's presenting to people a perfect situation according to their understanding of perfect. There's an old song when I was a boy, my father, I don't know where he got the words from, but I just remember this line. He would sing it for me when I was a little baby boy, so I never quite got the word, but it might have come from a play or something, you know, but it's talking about Adam and Eve. It says, and every day was Christmas Day, them get them pudding free, and everything belongs to them except one apple tree. I just remember the words. The songwriter is giving in the mind of a child what is happiness and what is bliss. I could empathize with that. When I was a little boy, I always looked forward to Christmas. It just seemed like the whole place changed. And I was getting presents, maybe not many because there were plenty of us, but at that time of the year, there were different songs in the air. There were lights everywhere. Everything was happening. I looked forward to Christmas as a little boy. So the song, is kind of like that. Every day was Christmas Day. They get their pudding free. Everything belonged to them except one apple tree. So God is kind of giving the Jews this kind of picture. In the land that I'm creating, every day will be Christmas. I know we don't believe in Christmas, but you get the idea. It's a parable. Every day will be according to your best images of what things will be like. So will it be like this in the new earth? Absolutely. But will the details be there? Absolutely not. Don't look at the details. Look at the principle behind what he's saying. This is true of many, many of these Old Testament prophecies. You can go through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, you find the same principle there. All of these prophecies. You look at these prophecies, you get a picture of a changed situation where God's people come into a situation that is ideal. But you have to change it according to the promises that you understand God has really made. God has not promised us land down in the Middle East. God has not promised that to the new Israel. God's promise to the new Israel is a spiritual land we will inherit. We will inherit the spiritual condition that he has promised. Those who are looking for land down in the Middle East or who are trying to produce land down there for the Jews, you completely are misunderstanding what God is saying. Now, this is a general idea of what I'm trying to say, and I'm going to pause, maybe stop, but I'm going to see if there are any questions or any comments that anybody would like to make at this time. I know I've said a mouthful. I know that all of it is a little complicated, a little bit, but if you get the general idea, I like that brother Juan Carlos says he's beginning to understand it. But is there any question, anybody, any comment?
Yeah, I have one. We was reading a passage that the Lord says, I would fix the breaches. In other words, there was a breach between Israel and God, So I was thinking, does these breaches had to do with the Levitical priesthood, because they had to have sacrifices and these priests were there to serve God, and it was a bloody mess, and there was a breach there. That's one that I wanted to ask you about, if that's correct. And the other one is, when you talked about the New Jerusalem, at one point it said about the kid should be a child should be was it 100-year-old and whatnot. But the thing is that when you go into the book of Revelation, it talks about us being caught up to heaven and in the New Jerusalem city for 1,000 years, and we come back down on that same city, which is the city that will be established on earth. So it's kind of hard for me to figure out what that part that I just talked about the child being 100 years old, while the other one is so, and this
Okay.
is the New Jerusalem.
Yes. If you remember the principle that it's not the details, it's the concept that God wants us to have. In the Jews' understanding, all right, let us say, I read a poem once. It's written by a Jamaican. It's called The Lament of the Banana Man. It's about a Jamaican farmer who goes to live in England. And at the end of every verse, the poem says, I can't go back to Jamaica now. And in the poem, he says, England is okay. I'm not complaining. If it cold, it cold. If it raining, it raining. But in the poem, you can get the feel of a man who is longing for a place where there's sunshine, where he can go out and climb on the hills. And he says, I can't go back to Jamaica now, but I would like to die there anyhow. Now, if I were a Jew, what is my idea of paradise? I'm in Babylon. What is my idea of paradise? I want a place where they didn't smash the heads of my children upon the stones, my people. I want a place where my children can grow to an old age, where even old people, you can live out your life fully. It says, as the days of a tree shall be the days of my people. You want a place where you can live and become an old man, and you don't have to worry about enemies coming on and looting your country, and you live in constant fear. God gave them a picture of this kind of thing. And God says, when I recreate what I'm going to do, it will be your idea of perfection. That was their concept of perfection. In the Old Testament, you cannot find many places that talks about heaven. In fact, about living in heaven. In fact, I don't know if there's any place where it talks about God's people ever going to heaven. I don't know. I could be wrong. But I can't recall too many places in the Old Testament, because that was not their hope. Their hope was a place on this earth where they would be free from the terrorism of their enemies. And so when God told them about paradise, when God told them about the coming future paradise, he gave them what they had in their mind. If I want to make my grandson really happy, well, he's 7 going on 8 now. When he was little, I could tell him that I'm going to take him to the seaside. That is heaven for him. I could talk to him about waves and but as he grows older, I have to adjust and I have to adapt. But you understand that when you're talking to people, once upon a time when I was a young Christian, I used to go to bed at night and dream about heaven. I used to dream about the water of life and the tree that bears 12 kinds of fruit every month. The image I had in my mind. As I grew older and I became more mature, I found my attention more and more fixated on God and Jesus, more and more on the relationship than upon the things. So what I'm saying in all of this is, I'm saying that God gave the Jews their idea of heaven, their idea of paradise. And it would be wrong, I'm saying it is wrong to take the details of that picture and to say it is what the real thing is going to look like. It's just the general concept. It's the general concept. What we are to understand is it's going to be a perfect place. Your idea of perfection is not the same as the Jews' idea of perfection. If God were telling you the same thing today, he might put it in the context of your idea of what America should be like. In fact, I don't think he would. If not, you're far smarter than that, right? Our knowledge of heaven and of spiritual things is far more complete today. And so God speaks to us directly and tells us about the things that will be there and what they will be like. But in those days, just like he gave them the law and he spoke to them in dark parables, he is using the arguments that they can understand. This is why when God spoke about the wars that they would fight in the last days, go to the Old Testament and look. Go to the book of Daniel. Go to the last few verses of Daniel 11. You see where he talks about chariots and horsemen and ships and the sound of the battle and the blood and the warrior and the spear. He's using the ideas that they have about warfare. Nobody fights with horses and swords and spears anymore. They're hardly even using guns anymore. But God uses this picture because it is what the people can understand in his time, in the time of the prophecies. So that is key to understanding these Old Testament prophecies. That's why it's so difficult sometimes to figure out what they are saying. And I'm saying, don't butter your head about it too much, because most of the time, looking at the details and trying to work out each detail is really almost going to guarantee that you're going to misunderstand. Anything else, anybody?
The Levitical priesthood was a breach also, right? I mean, between God's God's people because they had to do sacrifices. That was the breaches that he fixed as well. No?
I think the breach that is mentioned, the verse that I read, it was Ezekiel or Jeremiah, but the breach, it says the breaches were made in the walls of the temple. And if the temple today refers to the Christian church, and the breaches in the temple refers to the introduction of, I believe, false ideas and the deceptions that are in the church and the misconceptions about the church. Those are some of the breaches. A breach is a place where the strength of a wall is broken down. And there are places where the enemy could come through these walls. So I think it has to do with the things we believe and the weakness in our faith and the misconceptions about how to worship God. These false ideas, I believe, are some of the breaches.
Brother David.
Yes, brother Steve.
In Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance and obey it and so on. So by faith, in verse 9 says, by faith he sojourned in a land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which had foundations, whose maker and builder is God. Was this city that Abraham looked for, was it an earthly city or heavenly?
I believe that Abraham, there were some Old Testament people who had unusual insight into the prophecies of God, into the promises of God. The Bible suggests that Abraham was one of them. I know David was one of them, who had understanding beyond the people of their time. Because it says that Abraham, Jesus says of Abraham, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw my day and was glad. Abraham saw Christ more clearly than other people did, maybe through the sacrifice of Isaac. But also he seemed to have an idea when God actually promised Abraham the land of Palestine. He promised him a literal place, and Abraham actually looked for that place, and God told him that his seed would enter that place after 400 years, and they did. So there was a literal fulfillment of that promise. But when it says Abraham looked for a city, it shows you that in the back of Abraham's mind, there was a deeper understanding. He looked beyond the physical inheritance, and he understood that one day, the entire planet, the entire world would be under the dominion of righteousness and under the dominion of God. And so he looked for that. That is what I understand Hebrews to be saying.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome, my brother. I know I've been talking a little bit too loud and my voice is going a little bit, so I'm not going to say anything else unless I'm asked a question. So I'm waiting for you to say something or ask a question. If you don't, then we probably might have to close off the meeting here for this evening. So if you have anything to say, then go right ahead. I know that as soon as I close the meeting, everybody is going to be asking questions. Anyway, all right, that being the case, let me see. Is there anything else I wanted to say especially? There are other examples. There is an example. There's one outstanding example that maybe I should go to it. I was a little afraid to go there because this takes a whole evening by itself. I don't even want to touch it and then do a poor job on it. But since, we would be ending a little, I'm just going to touch on it, right? It's Zechariah 14. This is probably one of the strongest places in the Bible that illustrate what I'm trying to say. Because there are the whole chapter itself, it covers everything, and yet it covers it in such a confusing way. It talks about the day of the Lord coming. It says, the Lord shall go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. It goes on to say, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem in the east. And most of us understand that this is talking about the coming of Jesus the third time, when his feet stand upon the Mount of Olives. And it says, and the Lord my God shall come and all his saints with thee. So it's talking about that day at the end of the 1,000 years, it seems like. And it says, and in that day, it shall be in that day that living water shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, half of them toward the hinder sea. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth in that day. Shall there be one Lord, and his name one. And men shall dwell in it, and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Here's the hard part. And this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet, and their eyes shall consume away in their holds, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. And Judah also shall fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the heathen round about shall be gathered together, gold and silver and apparel in great abundance. What, after the 1,000 years? And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. The feast keepers love this one very much. Now look at the next line. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain after the 1,000 years. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. After the 1,000 years, this shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In that day shall there be upon the bells of the horses holiness unto the Lord, and the pots in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Now look, yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts, and all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe therein or cook therein. And in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. You will understand why I say that this chapter needs a whole session to study, to go through together. But I just wanted to show it to us, to show that there are contradictions in this chapter that are impossible to reconcile. You can't find any time in the history of the world when these conditions will exist, when they are going to be offering sacrifices and they are going to be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles after Jesus returns to earth the third time. All of this, it has to be regarded as God puts everything together in one package, one picture, and he's covering everything. All the elements in there are mixed together, and he's giving us what I would like to call a panorama of end time events, from the time of trouble going right through to the 1,000 years and beyond. One picture. Like if I want to give you a photograph of the history of America, I'm going to tell you what I, as a Jamaican, as a non-American, what I would think about based on the stories I read and the pictures I've had and the images in my mind. First, I draw a picture of a red Indian. Then I draw a picture of a musket. Then I draw a picture of cavalry officers. These are my images of America. Then I will draw a picture of slaves in the cane field. Then I will draw a picture of conflict between blacks and whites. And I could put all these on one page, and other things. I could draw a picture of a ton of money. I could draw a picture of other things. But anyway, you put all these pictures on one page, and you mix them up on the page. And somebody comes and looks at it, and he sees this is here, and this is here, and this is here, and it looks all confused because it's a panorama. It's not giving you a historical sequence. Neither is it giving you the details of American history. It's just snapshots of different things that happen. So you get a general idea, but not the details. Now, I kind of have a little feeling that in making this presentation, I have not answered many questions, I am sure. But what I wanted to do is to give us a picture, an approach to the prophecies where we are not looking at them as literal representations. Because if we do, and if we try to do this like so many Christians do, we are going to be very confused. That's the main point that I wanted to make this evening. Because at the same time, you have to look at each prophecy and you have to try to figure out what is the spiritual meaning of this. You look and you see how the apostles did it, and you try to follow that pattern. Sometimes you might misunderstand a little bit, but generally speaking, if we take this approach, we're going to get it right. All right. That was a big mouthful. I think we're going to close off, and then if there's any question, we'll take it afterwards. All right. And I'm going to just close the recording.